Can I stay if I repair your motorcycle? A teenager of 13 enters a motorcycle workshop carrying only oil-stained fingers and an urgent question. He has just one opportunity to demonstrate his worth. What remains unknown to him? This group does more than repair bikes. They mend shattered existences. However, he must first complete the project his grandfather began. The chime positioned over Thunder Fork's workshop entrance remained silent as Brian entered. Its malfunction dated back to March, mirroring numerous other items in the facility. He paused momentarily, his backpack slung over one shoulder, attempting to appear older than his actual 13 years. Three mechanics glanced up from a partially assembled Sportster. The nearest individual, bald-headed with muscular arms resembling tree limbs, placed his wrench down deliberately. "The shop's shut, young man." "That's incorrect," Brian responded, his voice breaking midway. He cleared his vocal cords and repeated himself. "The signage indicates you're open until 6 o'clock. The time is 5:30. The hairless mechanic, Butcher, though Brian remained unaware of this name, shared looks with his companions. "Have you lost your way?" "Negative, sir." Brian advanced deeper into the space, his footwear marking the oil-covered floor. His digits were already darkened with lubricant, as though he'd been performing mechanical work prior to his arrival. "I'm searching for Rex." This statement captured their focus. The mechanic positioned at the work surface straightened his posture, cleaning his palms on a cloth more soiled than his hands. Rex remained standing at the bench. Deep creases marked his countenance, some resulting from examining engine components, others from choices he likely wished he hadn't made. "And who's inquiring?" Rex questioned. Brian retrieved an item from his coat, oversized on his frame with twice-rolled sleeves, and extracted a worn photograph. He displayed it. "You were acquainted with my grandfather. James Carver traveled with your group during the 1990s. The workshop fell silent aside from the radio, broadcasting something faint and static-filled in the corner. Rex accepted the image, examining it longer than required. Upon looking upward, his facial expression had transformed. Jamie's descendant. The statement wasn't posed as a question. "I was informed he suffered a cerebrovascular accident several weeks prior. He's currently at County General, room 247. They're refusing to allow me to remain with him." Brian's facial muscles tightened. "Child welfare authorities intend to transfer me to Springfield, a group facility 300 miles distant. And your presence here is motivated by what?" Brian rotated and indicated the workshop corner where a rust-covered Harley rested beneath a covering laden with dust and spider silk. "Because I possess the ability to repair that motorcycle." Butcher released an actual laugh. "Young man, that machine has remained stationary for 6 years. 3 mechanics have examined it. The power unit is locked, electrical components destroyed. The transmission has likely fused into a single rusted mass. It's a 1987 FXRS low-rider model. Single cam, 5-speed design. The carburetor requires reconstruction, but the genuine issue stems from improper storage. Someone failed to empty the fuel system. Gasoline transformed into varnish, obstructing everything from the fuel valve to the fuel delivery system." Brian approached it with reverence. "You're also dealing with a fractured primary case covering. Notice that oil distribution pattern on the structure? And I'd wager the charging component corroded because someone positioned it adjacent to a water heating unit that leaked for extended periods." The 3 mechanics stared in astonishment. Brian removed the covering, sliding his palm across the frame. His digits halted at a location near the neck, following something carved into the metal. His throat constricted. JC 1989. Rex moved nearer, crouching alongside him. Your grandfather operated that motorcycle for 8 years. It was intended as his retirement present to himself. He never completed its restoration. I'm aware. Brian's voice diminished to barely audible. He informed me about it, said he'd instruct me on reviving it. We planned to accomplish it together after I reached 14. He gazed up at Rex, his eyes dry yet intense. My time has expired. The social worker arrives Friday. Without a destination, somewhere stable, I'm departing. And I cannot. He halted, swallowing forcefully. I cannot abandon him alone in that medical facility. So what's your proposition? I repair this motorcycle. Demonstrate I can contribute my share. You permit me to remain. I'll labor. I'll maintain cleanliness. I'll perform whatever requires completion. I simply need accommodation until... He didn't complete the sentence. Until what? Until his grandfather regained consciousness. Until some miraculous event occurred. Rex stood upright, crossing his arms. You possess equipment? Brian removed his backpack, unzipping it. The bag produced a metallic sound upon hitting the floor. Tools spilled outward, their chrome finish worn to expose steel. A socket collection his grandfather had purchased before Brian's birth. Screwdrivers featuring wooden grips smoothed by decades of handling. Your grandfather's equipment, Rex observed. 48 hours, Rex declared finally. You get that machine operational. We'll discuss the remainder. But you don't sleep on the premises. You don't create disorder. And if you commit theft of any kind, I'll contact law enforcement personally. Understood. Brian nodded with such vigor his neck produced a cracking sound. Butcher, provide him with a work illumination device and a seat. The young man will require both. As the others returned to their projects, Brian knelt beside the Harley and commenced work. He remained unaware that Butcher would spend the following 2 days observing him from the corner, noting every technique, every careful action. He didn't know that Millie would appear tomorrow with nourishment and inquiries he wasn't prepared to address. All he comprehended was this. He possessed 48 hours to complete what his grandfather initiated, and he wouldn't squander a single moment. The 22 hours into the project, Brian's hands trembled continuously. He disassembled the engine housings sometime following midnight, laboring beneath a solitary work lamp while the remainder of the workshop slumbered in darkness. The pistons emerged more easily than anticipated, but the cylinder interiors were deeply scratched. Someone had operated this engine at excessive temperature and intensity before abandoning it. Brian positioned himself cross-legged on the concrete, components arranged in precise sequence surrounding him, each piece positioned exactly where necessary, and attempted to recall what his grandfather had instructed him about salvaging damaged cylinders. You don't abandon something merely because it's damaged, the elderly man had stated once, hands stable despite the tremor that would manifest later. You identify what remains functional and construct from that foundation. Footsteps resonated from the office area. Butcher emerged carrying 2 coffee containers. He placed one beside Brian without verbal communication. He lowered himself onto an inverted bucket, examining the disassembled power unit. You comprehend what you're performing with that? Butcher inquired, not harshly, refining the cylinders. I have abrasive paper in my bag, various grain sizes. I'll smooth it properly. Verify the tolerances. Hope the pistons still conform to specifications. Brian accepted the coffee, burned his tongue, didn't concern himself. If not, I'm finished. Your grandfather taught you that technique. He instructed me in everything. Brian lifted a piston, rotating it in the illumination. I was 6 years old the initial time he permitted me to hold a tool. He informed me motorcycles resembled people. They'd communicate what was malfunctioning if you understood how to listen. Butcher consumed his coffee, eyes never departing the youth's hands. These weren't the fingers of someone who'd learned from internet videos. The manner Brian examined each component, the rhythm of his movements, the angle he positioned the parts to capture the light, that was muscle memory constructed over years. He was skilled, Butcher stated finally, the finest mechanic we ever employed before his departure. Brian's hands ceased movement. What motivated his leaving? You need to pose that question to him. I'm unable. He doesn't regain consciousness anymore. Brian placed down the piston carefully, as though it possessed greater weight than reality. Medical professionals state the stroke eliminated most of his speech capability. Even should he open his eyes, he won't possess the ability to communicate anything to me. The workshop entrance creaked open. A young woman entered, approximately 17 years old, transporting a paper container that emitted breakfast aromas. She possessed dark hair secured in a ponytail and wore a university garment despite the heat. Millie, Butcher greeted. I thought your arrival was scheduled for noon. I heard we had a circumstance. She observed Brian, then the scattered engine components. You're the youth. Brian, Millie Restrepo. My father serves as the club's legal counsel. She positioned the bag down, removing wrapped sandwiches. Have you consumed food yet? Brian shook his head negatively. She tossed one to him, retained the other for herself, seated herself on the floor across from him. So what's your strategy here, Brian? You repair this motorcycle. Then what? Then they permit my residence. For what duration? Until your grandfather improves? Until you reach 18 years of age. She consumed a bite, masticated, waited. Because I observed the documentation protruding from your bag. The foster care assignment form. It's dated for this Friday. Brian's jaw muscles tightened. That's my personal matter. It becomes everyone's concern when Rex is contemplating sheltering a minor without legal custody. Millie wasn't harsh about it, simply factual. I'm not attempting to expose you. I'm attempting to determine if there exists a method to make this function that doesn't conclude with everyone facing arrest. Butcher stood upright, stretched his back, producing a series of cracking sounds. I'll permit you two to converse. Brian, take a rest. You're ineffective to that engine if you lose consciousness. Following his departure, Millie extracted a notebook. Inform me about your circumstances. All of it. So Brian complied. His mother expired when he was 3 years old. His grandfather raised him in a residence that perpetually carried the scent of motor lubricant and Old Spice. There wasn't anyone else. No aunts making birthday calls, no cousins at Christmas celebrations. Just the two of them and whatever motorcycle was dismantled in the workshop. Just a 13-year-old youth who could reconstruct a carburetor in his sleep, but couldn't remain in the only residence he'd ever known because the state declared a stroke victim couldn't serve as a guardian. Millie recorded notes, posed questions, didn't promise anything. When she finally closed the notebook, she stated, there might exist something we can accomplish. Emergency kinship placement if we can locate a relative willing to accept temporary custody. Or She hesitated. Rex has provided foster care previously, a long time ago. If he still possesses his certification, and if he's willing, I don't require charity. No, you require a legal address and an adult's signature. Millie stood upright, dusted off her denim. Complete the motorcycle first. Demonstrate you're worth the difficulty. Then we'll observe what we can accomplish. She departed, taking the morning illumination with her. Brian turned back to the engine. 30 hours remained. He lifted the abrasive paper and commenced refining the first cylinder, counting strokes to prevent his mind from wandering to hospital chambers and social workers and everything beyond his control. The sun had ascended sufficiently to transform the workshop into an oven. Perspiration dripped into Brian's eyes as he labored, mixing with the lubricant until he couldn't distinguish where oil concluded and exhaustion commenced. But ceasing wasn't an alternative. Ceasing meant contemplating Friday, about Springfield, about losing the only family remaining. Around midday, he discovered it. The concealed compartment existed behind a false panel in the frame, revealed only when he removed the damaged primary case. Inside existed a small waterproof container. Brian's hands trembled as he opened it. Photographs, dozens of them. Young males on motorcycles laughing at the camera. His grandfather among them, perhaps 30 years old, with a full head of hair and a smile Brian had never witnessed on the elderly man's face. Rex was present too, lankier, less gray, and others, some Brian recognized as older versions of current club members. One photograph halted his breathing. A woman holding an infant, his grandfather's arm around her shoulders. On the reverse, in faded ink, Sarah and little Brian, 1992, his mother and him. Brian examined more photographs. His grandfather at birthday celebrations, instructing a toddler to operate a tricycle, holding a small boy's hand at what appeared to be a funeral. Every major moment documented and concealed inside this motorcycle like a time capsule. The final photograph was different. His grandfather alone, older now, standing before the Thunder Forks workshop with a Harley beside him. On the reverse, never too late to come home. Brian sat there on the cold concrete, photographs spread around him, and comprehended something he hadn't before. This motorcycle wasn't merely a restoration project. It was his grandfather's incomplete apology. And now was Brian's inheritance he'd been laboring for nearly 2 days continuously. The deadline was sufficiently close to taste. Brian's vision blurred as he tightened down the final cylinder head bolt. The engine was reassembled. Every component cleaned, measured, installed with the precision his grandfather had instilled in him. His fingers were raw, 2 nails fractured from forcing a stubborn bearing race. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. The workshop had filled up around sunset. Word had dispersed somehow, the youth attempting to resurrect Jamie Carver's ghost bike. Males leaned against work surfaces, arms crossed, observing, not mocking, simply waiting. Rex appeared beside him, cleaning lubricant from a connecting rod he'd been working on. Before you attempt starting that, need to inform you of something. Brian didn't glance up from the timing covering he was bolting on. I'm almost completed. Your grandfather didn't depart because he ceased caring about this club. Rex's voice carried across the quiet workshop. He departed because he cared more about your mother. She was 16 years old, pregnant, and the father was absent. Jamie had a choice: remain here with us or raise his daughter's child alone. Brian's fingers stilled on the tool. We informed him he could accomplish both. Bring the infant around. Let us assist. But Jamie understood what we were back then. We weren't simply a motorcycle club. We were involved in activities that could have gotten that infant taken away. So he walked away from his patch, his motorcycle, everything he'd constructed here to provide your mother a clean existence. Rex paused, and when she died, he did the same for you. Brian's throat burned. Why are you informing me of this? Because you're not simply repairing a motorcycle. You're attempting to complete something your grandfather initiated 20 years ago, coming home. And I need you to comprehend what that signifies. Rex crouched down to eye level. This club, we're not perfect. We got history, debts, complications. If you remain here, you're choosing that existence. So before you rotate that key, you need to be certain this is what you desire. I don't possess anywhere else to go. That's not equivalent to choosing to be here. Brian observed the Harley, then the males watching from the shadows, Butcher with his scarred knuckles, Millie sitting on a stool in the corner with a legal pad in her lap, others whose names he didn't know, but whose faces had become familiar over 2 days of borrowed time. My grandfather chose you once, Brian stated quietly. Then he chose me. I'm choosing both. Rex nodded slowly, stood upright, then completed. Brian installed the final components with shaking hands. Fuel lines connected, battery terminals tightened, oil filled to the proper line. He'd reconstructed the carburetor twice to achieve it correctly, rewired the entire electrical system, replaced the clutch plates with spares Butcher had donated from his personal collection. Everything was perfect. It had to be. He climbed onto the seat, felt the weight of his grandfather's jacket on his shoulders, and rotated the key. The fuel pump primed with a quiet hum. Good sign. He pulled in the clutch, pressed the starter. The engine rotated once, twice, caught with a stuttering roar that filled the workspace like thunder. 3 seconds of the most beautiful sound Brian had ever heard. Then it died. He attempted again. The starter cranked. The engine rotated, but nothing caught. No spark, no combustion, just the mechanical grinding of parts moving without purpose. Come on, come on. Brian's voice cracked. He ran through everything. Fuel flowing, kill switch correct, spark plug firing clean. Everything functioned except the engine. He attempted more times, each attempt weaker than the last. As the battery drained, nothing. Butcher moved closer, listening to the cranking sound. His expression changed. Youth, open the timing cover. I already did. Brian's hands trembled as he removed the bolts he'd just installed. When the cover came off, his stomach dropped. The timing mark was 180 degrees off. He'd installed the gear backwards. Such a simple mistake, something a first-year mechanic would catch. But Brian had been so exhausted, so desperate, so focused on getting everything perfect that he'd rushed the one thing you never rush. And now, with 6 hours left on Rex's deadline, he'd have to dismantle half the engine to correct it. He couldn't accomplish it in time. Brian's breath came in short gasps. He attempted to maintain composure, attempted to think of a solution, attempted to be the mechanic his grandfather had trained him to be. But he was 13 and exhausted and out of time, and the only home he had left was slipping through his oil-stained fingers. The photographs from the hidden compartment sat on the workbench, his grandfather's young face smiling at ghosts. I apologize, Brian whispered, uncertain if he was addressing the elderly man in the hospital or the ghost in the photographs. I'm so sorry. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Butcher knelt beside him, toolbox already open. Your grandfather didn't instruct you to complete motorcycles alone. He instructed you to initiate them. The old mechanic's voice was rough and quiet at once. Now, permit me to demonstrate how we complete them together. Rex called out across the workshop. Anyone got plans tonight? One by one, the males shook their heads. Good, Rex stated. Let's bring this one home. They labored through the night like a surgical team. Butcher called out instructions while Brian's hands moved inside the engine. Timing pin goes in the upper hole, not the lower. Feel it. Got it. Brian's voice was hoarse but steady now. Point two other mechanics, Diesel and Crow, held work lights at angles Butcher specified. Millie brought coffee every hour, said nothing, just squeezed Brian's shoulder and went back to her corner where she was drafting something on her laptop. Rex didn't labor on the motorcycle. He made phone calls, quiet conversations in the office that Brian attempted not to think about. Hours later, past midnight, Butcher permitted Brian to reinstall the timing gear himself. Slowly, triple-check the marks before you tighten anything. Brian's hands didn't shake anymore. He aligned the marks, checked them against the manual Diesel had pulled up on a tablet, checked them again with a flashlight at a different angle. Only when Butcher nodded did he torque the bolts to specification. They had the engine reassembled by the time dawn broke through the windows. First light was breaking through the workshop windows when Brian climbed back onto the seat. The audience had grown. More club members had arrived in the night, summoned by texts and phone calls. They lined the walls, watching something that mattered. Brian didn't pray. His grandfather had never been religious, but he thought about the elderly man's hands guiding his years of Sunday mornings in a workshop that smelled like coffee and motor oil, the patient voice explaining that mechanics wasn't about forcing things. It was about comprehending what wanted to happen and facilitating it. He rotated the key. The fuel pump hummed. He pulled in the clutch, took a breath that felt like it might be his last, and hit the starter. The engine rotated once, twice, then it caught. A roar filled the workshop, deep and clean and strong. The sound of 87 horsepower awakening after 6 years of silence. The whole workspace seemed to vibrate with it, and Brian felt the rumble through his legs, his chest, his bones. He gave it throttle. The engine responded perfectly, settling into a smooth idle that sounded like music. Someone cheered. Then everyone was cheering, hands clapping Brian's back, voices overlapping in celebration. But Brian just sat there, one hand on the grip, feeling the heartbeat of his grandfather's last unfinished dream. Rex walked over, had to lean close to be heard over the engine. Shut it down. Let's talk. In the office, Millie was already waiting. She slid papers across the desk. Hospital called an hour ago, Rex stated. Your grandfather's being transferred to the VA facility in Henderson. Better stroke care, therapy programs. I pulled some strings through our veteran network. He paused. As for you, Millie's been working on emergency placement paperwork. I still have my foster certification. It's expired, but she thinks we can expedite renewal. How long will that take? Brian's voice was small. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Too long for Friday's deadline. Rex looked at Millie. She picked up where he left off. So we're filing for temporary emergency custody with the club as collective guardians. It's unusual, but there's precedent in kinship situations. You'd stay here. We document that you have stable housing and supervision, and we'd argue that removing you would cause undue hardship given your grandfather's condition and your established support system. Will it work? Honestly? Maybe. Judge Carrera owes my dad a favor. and she's sympathetic to veteran families. Millie met his eyes. But you need to understand, this isn't a sure thing. If it falls through, you might still end up in Springfield. Brian looked at Rex. And if it works, I stay here for real. You earn your keep. Work the garage. Keep your grades up. Visit your grandfather every Sunday. Rex's expression was stern, but not unkind. This isn't charity, Brian. Your crew now. That means responsibilities. I understand. Good. Rex stood, walked to the window overlooking the garage floor. Your grandfather sent me something about 2 years ago. A letter I never answered. He said he was getting old, that he wanted to make peace before it was too late. Said he had a grandson who could rebuild a carburetor in his sleep. Rex turned back. I didn't believe him. Figured it was just an old man bragging. Guess I was wrong. The social worker came that Friday. Millie met her in the office with a folder 2 inches thick, documentation of Brian's living situation, character references from club members, the emergency custody filing, medical records showing his grandfather's transfer, even a letter from Brian's GD prep instructor. The woman looked exhausted, overworked, carrying too many cases. She reviewed the papers, asked Brian questions about where he slept and whether he felt safe. She interviewed Rex, inspected the storage room that had become Brian's bedroom, small but clean, with an actual bed now instead of cot. When she departed, she didn't take Brian with her. 3 months later, Brian stood beside his grandfather's hospital bed. The elderly man's eyes were open but distant, his right side still paralyzed. Brian held his hand and told him about the motorcycle, about Thunder Forks, about Butcher teaching him to properly gap spark plugs. We got it running, Grandpa, just like you wanted. His grandfather's fingers twitched once. Maybe reflex, maybe recognition. 2 weeks after that, James Carver died peacefully in his sleep. They held the memorial at the workshop. 20 motorcycles lined up outside, his grandfather's old Harley at the front with Brian in the seat. They rode to the cemetery together, then to the old lookout point where James used to take his daughter, where he taught Brian to skip stones in the creek below. Brian scattered the ashes there while the club stood silent behind him. Nobody mentioned patching Brian in, not that day or in the weeks after. Life at Thunder Forks settled into something Brian had never had before: routine. He turned 14 covered in transmission fluid. 15 came during a heat wave, rebuilding an iron head that fought him every step. By 16, he could diagnose problems by sound alone, just like his grandfather did on that birthday. He walked into the workshop and stopped. A frame hung on the wall where vintage photos usually lived. His grandfather's original Thunder Forks patch, cleaned and preserved behind glass. Below it, a brass plate caught the morning light. Earned, not given. Welcome home. It was proof that some things were worth the 3 years it took to build them, right? Brian stood there, reading those words, understanding finally what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. Family wasn't about blood or patches or club colors. It was about showing up when someone needed you, about finishing what others started, about choosing to belong. Brian didn't just repair a motorcycle that night. He reconstructed a bridge between generations and found a family his grandfather never stopped believing in. What would you sacrifice to demonstrate you belong? Share your thoughts below. And if this story touched you, press that like button and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that remind us what family truly means. See you in our next video.